So this slide presentation is about how behavior geneticists study personality using genetic methods. It's rather interesting. Um, so within each nucleus of each cell in the body, there are two complete sets of the human genome. Of course, you know that already. One formed from the mother and one from the father. You have to still figure out the sequence, the gene role of gene sequence plays in the human body and mind and behavior, but they're getting closer every day. It used to be back in the 50s and 60s that they thought there was this thing called junk DNA, just kind of leftover materials, but in fact we're finding out today that that's not true at all. Each individual has characteristics and individual knowledge that are similar but differences, and that these things, as we mentioned earlier, are consistent over time. The controversy is how to study the human gene, and it's led to some incredibly complicated and controversial methods, probably the worst of all, called eugenics. But what do the findings really mean about genes and behavior? Well, the goal of behavior genetics is to reveal the contribution, that is the percentage of variation that's due to the environment, and the contribution that's caused by genetic or hereditary factors. It also reveals how genes and environment interact, called epigenetics. So one of the definitions on the study sheet is this one. What is heritability? Well, first and foremost, it's a statistic. It refers to the proportion of observed variation in a group of individuals that can be accounted for by genetics. We're going to talk in the subsequent PowerPoints or videos about some of the different types of behavior genetics and factors that are studied, but suffice it to say, it's a genetic accounting. It describes the degree to which genetic differences between individuals cause differences in observed properties such as height, extroversion, or thrill-seeking. These observed individual differences are called phenotypic variation. So your genotype is your genetic variation, and it is the total collection of genes possessed by any individual. The phenotype is how those things are expressed. Okay, so they're slightly different. The environmental component is simply the proportion of phenotypic variation that is not attributable to genetic variation. We call this environmentality. So it's the opposite of heritability. And it's a percentage, it's a statistic again, a percentage of the observed variation in a group of individuals that can be attributed to environmental factors. So heritability and environmentality have an inverse relationship. If heritability goes up, then environmentality goes down, and vice versa. If you added heritability, the percent, together with environmentality, it should add up to 100%. So a couple of things to note before we talk about specifically about some of the techniques. Heritability effects are different in populations and not in individuals. So, for example, you could be talking about a pygmy tribe of humans in Africa. That average height might be 5 feet tall. Within that population, there could be someone who's 6'2". Okay, so the heritability, though, we know about the genetic patterns, do hold up for the population in spite of individuals having differences. The second point is heritability is not a constant. If it was, then we would have no evolution. In an environment, if the environment changes, then heritability can change too. And lastly, heritability is not a precise statistic. It's an estimate. So they're doing their best to try to figure out the proportion of which factor is caused by what. So how do they do that? Well, they jump headlong into the nature-nurture debate. And at the individual level versus the population level, things are different. If it does not occur at the individual level, but is an issue at the populational level, then they can explore that. And how do they do that? They do that by looking at 4 different techniques. One of them is called selective breeding. Now this goes by other names like eugenics, and is just rife with unethical considerations. So the Nazis, for example, were engaged in eugenics during World War II. So what's interesting, though, is that the United States government was also involved in eugenic practices too, not only in during World War II, but before that. There were some schools in Virginia that selectively bred or prohibited people from breeding who had low IQs. Is this unethical? Probably. And so we don't really talk about those things too much anymore, but when you think about it on a practical level, most people practice this anyway. When you select a mate, you're selecting who you're breeding with. It may not be based on their height or their handsomeness or their musculature or whether they'd be a good fighter, but in fact, we do, to some extent, use selective breeding. Would you have the same individual ethical concerns if we were talking about cows? Probably not. So this area is one that can obviously be debated. We don't have time in an online class to do that, although it might be interesting at some point to actually sit down and talk about this. Family studies is another approach to studying behavior genetics. It studies the correlation between the degree of genetic overlap among family members with the degree of personality similarities. So you and all of your siblings possess at least 50% of the genes from your parents. They may not be the same. Some of them might be the same. If a personality characteristic is highly heritable, then family members with greater genetic relatedness should show more of more similarity to each other than family members with less genetic relatedness. The problem with family studies, though, is that they may or may not be growing up in the same environment. But even that's questionable. So if you are the third child in a family of 3, and there's 10 or 12 years difference between you and the firstborn, are you actually growing up in the same environment? That's questionable. Having 3 children of my own, I know that we didn't parent the same way with the first as we did with the last. I remember growing up as a child, my godparents, had 20 years difference between, they had 2 children, the first and the last. They were very different people by the end of the second pregnancy. Another approach is using twin studies. This is pretty much the go-to. It looks at heritability of identical twins that share 100% of the genes, or fraternal twins that share 50% of the genes. So you know that identical twins actually split off from the same egg early in gestation, whereas twin studies with fraternal twins are actually twins with that are more like siblings, just growing up in the same environment. Using twin studies allows us to look at the influence of both genes and heredity. But there are ethical issues to consider too. What about identical twins separated at birth? There are tremendous ethical issues with this. Other important considerations include whether or not the environments are equal. It assumes that they are. I have a twin brother. We're not identical, we're fraternal twins, and we actually had very different growing up environments because we just didn't run in the same circles, especially after grade school. So there's some concerns about the validity of the equal environments assumption. And of course, the last one is adoption studies. This is a powerful approach that examines the correlation between adopted children and their adopted parents with whom they share no genes. So this is all about environment. If one finds a positive correlation between adopted children and their adopted parents, then this provides strong evidence for environmental influences on the personality. It also avoids the equal assumptions, environments assumption, which is tough to get around. There are concerns, however, about the assumption that adoptive parents and adopted children are representative of the population in general. They may not be. Adopting a child is a huge undertaking, and especially think about people that adopt special needs children, maybe 3 or 4 of them. Do they represent the population at large? They may not. So there are also issues with selective placing of children in homes of parents that are similar to the birth parents on some specific trait. It could be deliberate, it could be unconscious. Twins reared apart are the strongest test of environmental influences, but of course, these are extremely rare. So now we move on to the next chapter.